One wrong step, and they would fall. One wrong cut, and the tree could crush them. Yet two loggers stood on narrow wooden planks, hammered into the side of a living giant, preparing to bring it down with nothing but axes, muscle, and a long steel saw. The Douglas fire towered more than 250 feet into the fog-soaked forests of Washington Territory. Its trunk was wider than the room the men slept in, while its lowest branches hung higher than a 20-story building. But its enormous size was not the only problem. Near the ground, the trunk was swollen, split, and flooded with thick resin that could trap a saw within minutes. Cutting from the base was almost impossible, so the loggers climbed above it. They carved small openings into the bark, forced wooden springboards into the cuts, and balanced on them high above the forest floor. Then, standing on planks barely wide enough for their boots, they began soaring into the giant. "I have enough research. Let me write the script now." The plank beneath their feet was called a springboard. It was simple, 5 or 6 feet long, 6 to 8 inches wide, about 2 inches thick, made from a light but strong wood, so it could be carried from tree to tree. At one end, a blacksmith had fitted a steel shoe with a curled-up lip. That lip locked into the notch the men had chopped into the trunk. Once their weight pressed down, the board held firm, and from that narrow shelf, balanced 8 or 10 feet above the forest floor, they would bring down a tree that weighed as much as 100 tons. This was not a stunt, it was a daily routine, and it built the Pacific Northwest. The forests of the Pacific Northwest were unlike anything the lumber industry had seen before. In the eastern United States and the upper Midwest, loggers had spent decades cutting forests of pine, oak, and maple. Those trees were large by most standards, but they were manageable. A man could stand on the ground, set his saw against the trunk, and work his way through. But, as eastern forests were cleared, in the decades after the Civil War, logging companies pushed west. What they found in the coastal valleys of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California stopped them in their tracks. The Douglas fir, the western red cedar, the western larch, the redwood. These were not normal trees, they were ancient. Many were 200 to 500 years old. Between 1890 and 1920, old-growth Douglas firs were recorded at heights of 350 to 450 feet. Some redwoods were even taller. Their trunks could measure 10, 12, even 15 feet across at the base. And the base itself was the problem. The first 4 to 12 feet of these trees were often swollen into what loggers called a butt swell. Over centuries, sap and resin had migrated downward, pooling at the bottom of the trunk. The wood there was saturated with pitch. It was riddled with fire scars from wildfires that had swept through decades earlier. It had ring shake, splitting along the growth rings, and heart checks, long cracks that radiated outward from the center like spokes on a wheel. This wood was worthless to the sawmill. It would not produce clean lumber. And worse, the resin gummed up cross-cut saws so badly that the blade would seize in the cut, stuck fast, impossible to pull. So the loggers had to get above it. The solution was the springboard, and no one knows for certain who invented it. The name of the person who first thought to chop a notch into a giant tree and stand on a plank above the worthless base is lost. But the idea spread quickly through the logging camps of Washington and Oregon in the 1880s and 1890s, and it changed the industry. The process worked like this. 2 men, working as a pair, approached the tree. They were called sawyers, or fallers, the men whose job was to bring the tree down. First, they studied the tree. They looked at which way it leaned. They read the branches and the slope of the ground to figure out where it would fall. Direction mattered. A tree that size could crush everything in its path for 100 feet or more. If it fell the wrong way, it could snap other trees, roll down a hillside, or kill someone standing below. A skilled sawyer could control the direction of fall within a few feet, but only if he set his cuts with care. The 2 men stood on opposite sides of the trunk. Each one took a double-bit falling axe, an axe with a sharp blade on both sides of the head, fitted with a handle longer than normal so he could reach deep into the cut. He swung the axe into the bark and began to chop. The notch he cut was shallow, only 3 or 4 inches deep, and 8 to 14 inches wide. That was all it took. The steel shoe on the end of the springboard had a curled lip that seated into that shallow notch, and when a 200-pound man stepped onto the board, His weight drove the lip tighter into the wood, locking it in place. Once the first springboard was set, the sawyer climbed up. He stood on the plank, his boots pressing it against the tree, and chopped a second notch above him, again about waist-high, slightly offset from the first. He pulled out his second springboard, set its steel shoe into the new notch, and stepped up. Now he was 2 boards high, perhaps 8 to 12 feet off the ground. If the butt swell was especially large, he might go 3 boards high. Each man carried his own set of boards, and each time they went up another level, they had to make sure their notches faced the direction the tree was meant to fall, because when they were done, they would need to pivot and cut the back of the tree from the same position. The springboard had a clever design feature. The steel shoe's tip had a slight curve to it, a radius that allowed the sawyer to rock the board forward and backward, pivoting on the lip inside the notch. This meant he could slide the board forward to reach the front of the tree and cut his undercut, then walk the board backward, 1 boot on top, 1 underneath, bouncing the plank along its pivot, to reach the back of the trunk for the final cut. A single notch could serve both sides of the tree. This saved time, and in a forest where every tree took hours to fell, time mattered. Now came the saw. The crosscut saw was a long, flat blade with handles at both ends. For felling large timber, 2-man saws ranged from 4 to 12 feet long. The men called them misery whips. The name fit. The saw was heavy. The teeth were designed to cut on the pull stroke, which meant each man pulled the blade toward himself, while the other let it slide, then reversed. The motion was relentless. For hours, they pulled back and forth, the blade grinding through wood that was dense, wet, and sometimes harder than anything they had cut before. The first cut was the undercut. The sawyers drove the blade in about 1/3 of the way through the trunk, then set the saw aside and took up their axes. Working from the top down, they chopped out a wedge of wood, meeting the saw cut at the bottom. This undercut was the hinge that would steer the tree as it fell. The sawyer placed his axe head into the cut and sighted down the handle, using it like a gun barrel to aim the direction of fall. If the angle was off, he sawed a little more, chopped a little more, checked again. Precision at this stage meant survival later. Then they walked their springboards to the back of the tree and began the back cut. This was the cut that would bring it down. They sawed 3 or 4 inches above the undercut, leaving a band of uncut wood between the 2 cuts, the holding wood, that kept the tree standing while they worked. As they sawed, they hammered wedges into the saw cut, the kerf, to keep the trunk from pinching the blade. A pinched saw was a trapped saw, and freeing it could take valuable time or snap the blade entirely. To keep the saw moving, they oiled it. Kerosene was common. For western larch, whose pitch was water-soluble, they used soapy water. The oil was carried in recycled beer or whiskey bottles, each fitted with a curved metal hook that hung from the bark of the tree, within easy reach. As the back cut deepened and the holding wood narrowed, the 2 men communicated. They called out how much wood was left. They listened. With a cross-cut saw, unlike a chainsaw, there was no engine noise. They could hear each other clearly. They could hear the tree. A deep groan would rise from the trunk, a sound that traveled through the wood and into the springboards under their feet. The fibers of the holding wood would begin to crack and pop, and then the tree would go. Old loggers said the safest place to be when the tree fell was on the springboards. This sounds like madness. A man standing on a plank wedged into the side of a falling tree, 8 or 10 feet off the ground, should be the first to die. But the logic was grim and real. The base of the tree, the butt, was the most violent part when it hit the ground. It could kick backward, slamming into the earth with enough force to launch splintered wood like shrapnel. A man on the ground near the base could be crushed or impaled. Up on the springboard, the sawyer was above the worst of the kick. As the tree began to tip, he stepped off the board and moved quickly along the fall line, away from the direction the butt would kick. It was a calculated risk, in a job built entirely on calculated risks. The numbers tell the rest of the story. In 1879, Washington produced 160 million board feet of lumber. By 1905, it was the leading timber-producing state in the nation. By 1919, that number had reached 4.9 billion board feet. In the late 1920s, production peaked at 7 billion board feet per year. A 1910 study by the United States Bureau of Corporations found that 63% of all wage earners in Washington were directly or indirectly dependent on the timber industry for their jobs. The wood cut from these forests built the cities of the West Coast. It framed houses in San Francisco, warehouses in Seattle, railroad ties across the Great Plains. It was shipped south and east by rail and by sea. The springboard men and the misery whips fed a national hunger for lumber that seemed, at the time, as though it would never end. The men who did this work were not wealthy. In the early 1900s, a logger earned about 65 cents for a 10-hour day. By 1920, wages had risen to roughly $1 a day. They lived in logging camps, scattered through the valleys and hillsides, far from towns. The camps were almost entirely male. Bunkhouses measured about 10 by 24 feet and housed as many as 16 men in two-tiered wooden bunks, packed so close together that they had to crawl in from one end. The men called them muzzle loaders. They socialized on a long bench that ran the length of the bunkhouse, known as a deacon's seat. Their personal belongings, everything they owned, went into a canvas grain bag tied at both ends with rope, called a turkey, which sat on the bunk or stayed on their body. The food was plentiful but plain: salt pork, beef, fish, stews, beans, rice, oatmeal, grits, bread, pies. The men consumed up to 9,000 calories a day just to fuel the labor their bodies demanded. Meals were eaten fast. No talking was allowed at the table except to ask for food to be passed. A meal was finished in about 12 minutes. Then the men went back to the trees. The workforce was diverse but divided. Scandinavian immigrants, Swedish, Norwegian, and Finnish men who had worked forests in their home countries, formed logging crews throughout the Pacific Northwest. They were drawn to the region because the landscape reminded them of home and because the work was familiar. But the industry operated on an ethnic hierarchy. The best-paying jobs, falling and mill work, were generally reserved for white men born in North America or Northern Europe. Chinese workers had been employed in the industry in the 1880s, but faced organized campaigns to drive them out. In 1885, under pressure from the Knights of Labor, the Tacoma Mill Company and the Port Blakely Mill fired their Chinese employees. Other groups were channeled into lower-paying and more dangerous roles. The names of most of these men, the fallers, the swampers, the choker setters, the whistle punks, were never recorded in any archive. They appear in photographs as faces without captions, standing on stumps or beside fallen giants, their identities lost to time. What is recorded is the toll. A historian named Andrew Mason Prouty studied logging deaths on the Pacific coast and published his findings in a book called More Deadly Than War: Pacific Coast Logging, 1827 to 1981. His numbers are staggering. In the early 20th century, 1 in every 150 loggers in Washington died every year. That rate was so high that 1/3 of all 18-year-old loggers would not live to see 65. Beyond the deaths, nearly 1 in 5 loggers and 1 in 8 mill workers suffered some form of injury on the job each year. Trees fell the wrong way. Cables snapped under load. Logs rolled without warning. In the sawmills, men who shaped shingles, called shingle weavers, steered blocks of wood through fast-moving blades. It was said that shingle weavers recognized each other by the fingers missing from their hands. If this kind of history moves you, the stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary and dangerous work with nothing but their hands and simple tools, then subscribe to this channel. We uncover these forgotten chapters because they deserve to be remembered, and we will keep telling them as long as you keep watching. The most dangerous moment in the springboard felling process was not the sawing, it was the moment after. When the tree hit the ground, the work was far from over. A felled Douglas fir of that size had to be cut into manageable lengths, a job done by men called buckers, who worked with their own crosscut saws on the fallen trunk, often standing on the log itself or balancing on the hillside beside it. Then the logs had to be moved. In the earliest days, this was done with oxen and horse teams. Teamsters, sometimes called bull punchers or bull whackers, drove the animals, dragging logs over skid roads, trails paved with greased logs laid crosswise so the timber could slide over them. Men called grease monkeys coated the skids with lubricant so the heavy logs would not catch and stall. It was brutal, punishing work, and it went on in all weather, through rain, snow, mud, and darkness. As the industry grew, technology arrived. Steam donkeys, steam-powered winches, replaced animal teams in many operations. Steel cables replaced ropes. High-lead logging systems used tall trees as spars, with pulleys and cables rigged near the top. A man called a high climber, or tree topper, strapped iron climbing hooks to his legs and shinned up a tree that might be 150 or 200 feet tall, chopping off branches as he went. At the top, he cut off the crown of the tree and rigged cables and pulleys to the truncated trunk. Logs were then dragged through the air, suspended above the ground, and swung to a landing area. The system was efficient. It was also deadly. Moving huge logs through the air above workers' heads increased the number of accidents dramatically. A cable that snapped under tension could whip across a clearing with enough force to cut a man in half. In areas where rivers reached the camps, logs were driven downstream. Crews known as river rats or river pigs walked the floating logs, guiding them with pike poles, breaking up jams with axes, and sometimes with dynamite. A powder monkey, the camp's explosives expert, would set charges beneath a tangled mass of logs and clear the river by force. Men fell from logs into freezing water, were crushed between timber, or drowned under jammed wood. The rivers ran with logs from spring melt through summer, and the men worked them until the drives ended and the camps moved on. The springboard era did not end suddenly, it faded. The golden age of the crosscut saw lasted roughly from 1880 to 1930. After World War II, chainsaws spread rapidly through the industry. A chainsaw could do in minutes what two men with a misery whip did in hours. It did not need springboards in the same way. A man with a chainsaw could cut lower, faster, and with far less labor, though the danger of the work itself never disappeared. The crosscut saw was retired. The springboard was set aside. The old skills, the notch, the steel shoe, the pivot, the aimed undercut, became relics. They survived only in timber sports competitions, where contestants still chop notches into artificial poles, spring up on boards, and race to cut the top off with an axe. A perfect board hold can be set in 4 swings of an axe, and can carry a 280-pound man. Today, if you walk through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, you can still see what these men left behind. On the Olympic Peninsula, in the Cascade foothills, in the old-growth reserves of Oregon and Idaho, there are stumps. They stand in clearings and along trails, some of them 100 years old or more, slowly decaying back into the soil. And if you look closely at the sides of these stumps, you will see the notches. 2 of them, sometimes 3, cut into the wood at intervals rising up the trunk, each one a shallow rectangular hole about the size of a man's hand. Those are the springboard notches. They are the only marks left by the men who stood there, balanced on planks, and brought down trees that were older than the United States itself. The stumps are enormous. Some are 6 feet across at the top, where the cut was made, and wider still at the base. They are the ghosts of trees that once rose 300 feet into the sky. You can press your hand into a notch and feel where the axe bit into the wood a century ago. You can stand beside the stump and try to picture the tree that grew from it. The height, the weight, the centuries it stood before 2 men with a saw and a plank brought it down. The contrast with today is sharp. A modern logging operation uses machines the size of houses. A single operator in a sealed cab can fall, delimb, and buck a tree in under a minute, never leaving the seat. The chainsaw, the skidder, the harvester, these tools turned what was once a day's labor for a crew of men into a task measured in seconds. Efficiency replaced craft. And something was lost in that exchange, even as the world gained speed and safety. The men who worked the springboards did not think of themselves as artists. They were laborers. They were paid cents an hour for work that could kill them before lunch. They slept in crowded bunkhouses and ate in silence. They carried their lives in canvas bags. Many of them were immigrants who had crossed oceans to stand on a plank in a forest they had never seen before and cut down a tree taller than any building in their home country. They did this because the work was there, because the country needed wood, and because there were few other options for men with strong backs and steady hands. But what they did required a kind of knowledge that no machine has ever fully replaced. Reading a tree, its lean, its weight, its hidden rot, the direction it would fall, was a skill built over years, learned through watching and through near misses. Setting a springboard notch in the right place, at the right depth, aimed in the right direction, was a judgment that could not be written down in a manual. Aiming a falling tree with an axe handle as a sight, hearing the first crack of the holding wood, knowing when to step off the board and which way to run, these were skills that lived in the body, passed from one man to the next in the cold, wet forests of the coast. Most of those men are gone now. Their names were not preserved. The trees they cut are gone too, turned into lumber, turned into houses, turned into the bones of cities that most people will never connect back to a plank wedged into a Douglas fir in 1888. But the stumps remain. They stand in the woods like headstones, quiet and enormous, bearing the notches that prove someone was there.